paper I'm presenting today is titled Inter-Household Heterogeneity in Preferences and Marital Instability. And what I'm going to be studying is the relationship between intra-household heterogeneity in risk and trust attitudes and marital instability. So just as a very broad motivation, I think these are pretty obvious things. Preferences are fundamental determinants of decision making. And anytime we think about decisions like becoming an entrepreneur, investing in stocks, things like risk attitudes are going to be crucially important. And in recent years, especially, there's been a growing body of work, especially in behavioral and experimental economics, that has looked at, well, we know that risk, for example, risk preferences and trust attitudes or trust preferences are extremely important from a theoretical perspective. What happens when we look to the data and we look at field behavior? Do we see correlations between risk attitudes and trust attitudes and actual individual outcomes? And what we find is, for example, what we would expect. So nothing surprising, but people who are less risk averse are more likely to invest in stocks, are more likely to become entrepreneurs, also more likely to smoke. And when you think about trust attitudes, well, also people who are more trustworthy are also more likely to repay their loans. So it seems like preference definitely matter from an empirical point of view when we're looking at individual kind of behaviors. Now, what we know much less about is how does the composition of risk and trust preferences affect group behavior. And what I'm going to in particularly focus on is group dissolution. And I think for this audience, it's not really important to say, or not really difficult to understand, that one of the most important groups in society is marriage. And so what I'm going to be looking at is that marital dissolution or household dissolution, so when couples break up. And this is important because of several reasons. One of the reasons that makes it important is that marital dissolution is associated with higher child obesity, higher criminality rates, and lower educational attainment. So if we're thinking about how matches occur between couples and how couples form, and we think we'd like to optimally see good matches in society, it would be nice to understand what leads to the breakup of those couples. And so what I'm going to ask in this paper is intra-household heterogeneity in trust and preferences related to marriage survival? Now I'm going to try to do several exercises with the data to try to see whether the direction of causality is actually the one that I am suggesting. And I'm going to show you different aspects of the data. Okay. So why should it matter? Why should the composition of risk and trust preferences be important? Well, going back to Becker's model of household formation, when we think about assortative matching, well, we would expect heterogeneity to be optimal when preferences or attitudes are substitutes, but actually we would expect it to be not optimal when preferences or attitudes are complements. And so this would suggest, well, in some preferences we may see positive assortative matching, on other dimensions we may see negative assortative matching, but we know very little about which dimensions would lead to one or the other. For example, if we concentrate on risk preferences, well, there are reasons to think why that an optimal in the stable matching, an optimal assortative matching, quote unquote, may be negative if we think about risk-sharing models. So fully efficient risk-sharing, you would potentially predict that households negatively assortatively match on their risk attitudes. Now, if you think about models in which what happens is there's joint decision making, like the provision of a public good, then alignment of preferences may be actually desirable. And ex ante, and as far as I know, there's little evidence, little knowledge as to which of these could actually be the one that is more relevant in the data.
Yes. Even in risk-sharing, you got negative assortative matching in a very specific model in which the income is exogenous and we just match to share risk.
Yes.
If there are choices on income, things are much more complex, and you might actually have positives.
True. Yeah. So I've seen one working paper where, in the absence of where there's limited commitment, you may also get positive assortative matching. So that's definitely the case. I mean, this is just to give an example of cases where you may expect negative assortative matching under certain conditions. In other conditions, you may expect actually positive. And my approach is here, empirical, is to ask, okay, if we look at the data, what is the data suggesting? Okay, so what am I going to do in this paper? Basically, examine this the empirical relationship between household heterogeneity in risk and trust preferences and marital and future marital dissolution or separations. And what I'm going to use is the German socioeconomic panel. And it's going to become clear as I go through the talk why I use this panel. But the advantage of this panel data set is that it has the earliest measurements on risk and trust attitudes, such that I can have an early measure of those attitudes and look at what happens to couples over time. And what is also important is, well, if you're thinking about couples and getting a large sample of couples in which you have a measurement of risk and trust preferences is hard, so you're more likely, or the easiest way to go about it is to use survey measures, but you want to make sure that those survey measures that you're using as proxies for actual preferences are valid, are not just noise or unrelated to actual risk preferences. And the advantage of this data set of the German socioeconomic panel is that they've experimentally validated those measures. Okay, so just very briefly, this is not a full literature review. I'm just very briefly mentioning papers that have looked at heterogeneity that I am aware of, heterogeneity within the couple, and what the consequences could be in terms of either marital instability or actually savings choices. So there's early work, of course, looking at social demographic characteristics, also in sociology. You find that differences in age, differences in religion, differences in race, differences in education tend to be associated with a higher likelihood of divorce. There's also more recent work showing that maybe this heterogeneity need not be symmetric. So if the wife earns more than the husband, then the likelihood of separation increases. And there's more recent work, experimental work, where Simone Scheiner, what she looks at is heterogeneity in time preferences and gives couples savings decisions and observes that when the couples have more different time preferences, they are more likely to make inefficient savings choices. Okay, so in general, what the evidence out there is suggesting is that actually heterogeneity tends to lead to worse outcomes. That's the general picture so far. What I'm going to look at, which hasn't been done in the literature before, is first look at risk and trust, so two very important preferences, and look at the relationship with a very important outcome, which is marital separation or household separation. Okay.
But you want to separate heterogeneity from risk. So heterogeneity is sort of unknown for the person who starts the program, but that means that it's a risk for the person.
Excuse me, I couldn't really hear the question.
You mentioned you talked about heterogeneity and risk together, but different concepts.
So I'm going to talk exactly about how I define heterogeneity in risk attitudes, but what I very simply mean is you have a measure of someone's person risk attitude, which would be a proxy of the risk aversion parameter of one person in the couple. And then you have a measure for the other person, and the heterogeneity is going to be the distance between these two persons. That's the difference, absolute difference between them. Am I answering your question? Maybe.
Isn't it, in addition to risk attitude, is it also the exposure to risk that, and then the combination of both are really what matters?
Definitely, those are going to be things that are going to be important. I'm going to try to control for as many things as I can, but yeah. So one thing that I could look at is I'm looking at income as control and so on, but you could think about variance in income and things like this to add into the analysis. No, that's definitely things that the data is rich enough to think about proxies of the exposure to risk, but of course, some things I've included, some things I should probably
be careful here because there's a lot of literature on so-called risk tolerance that confounds what we would call risk aversion and risk perception. Mm-hmm. So if you actually look at the hypothetical question in the SOETs, are you generally a person who's fully prepared to take risks, or do you try to avoid taking risks? And that confounds risk perceptions and risk attitudes.
That's the question. I'm going to come to the question exactly, but yeah, that's the wrong translation of the question, actually. So the
Took it
question,
from the Doman paper, sorry.
but yeah, no, I mean, it's the question is, how willing are you to take risk? Completely unwilling or fully willing? That's the question, and it's a risk in different dimensions. But those are proxies, and you're right that maybe the measurements are confounding different factors. But the question would be, if the measures are not perfect and I'm getting some kind of noise, when I look at the difference, am I biasing my results in one direction or the other? And I've tried to think of ways in which this noise or measurement error may bias things. And I don't have a clear idea of if it may bias things in one direction or the other. To me, it seems... So
you're just looking at separation. You're not looking at household formation. I mean, you consider formation as exogenous.
No. So I'm first not going to make statements about causality. That's the first. I'm going to try to use my data to address some of the issues of reverse causality and unobserved heterogeneity. But I'm aware that there's positive assortative matching, and I'm going to show you the data that reveals that that's the case. It's definitely, for me, it's impossible to randomly match couples, right? I'd love to do it and see what the results are. And I think that that's the perfect way of measuring the impact of heterogeneity. But given that I cannot do it, then I still think the question is interesting and important. And so I'm trying to do my best with the data that I think is actually the best data that is available to do it. But there might be, I've thought about places where you think about exogenous marital, where parents marry their children, but then it's the parents' preferences. So even in those cases, it's not really exogenous, or random, sorry. So in this panel, in 2004, there were several measures through survey questions of risk attitudes. In 2003, there were several measures of trust attitudes. I'll come to exactly those measures in a minute. And what I'm going to use is the data set from 2004 until 2013. And I'm going to measure separation in the household. So I'm looking at cohabiting couples. Most of them, 70%, are married. Some of them are cohabiting. So I'm going to define a separation either if a marriage splits or a cohabiting couple splits. And over 10 years, at the end of 10 years, I see 9.5% of divorce. Okay, so to Glenn's question, I mean, that's the reading. I speak German, so I also know the German version of the question. But my reading of the question and how I read Doman et al.'s paper, as they write about it, maybe I'm wrong, but I looked at the paper 1,000 times, of course. How willing are you to take risks is asked in 6 different dimensions.
Let's just clarify.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
The question I said at the beginning is the first text taken straight out of the SOEP, then it goes on to this one.
Okay.
So we're both right.
Okay. Then my apologies. So the question is, the questions are, how willing are you to take risks in general, while driving, in financial matters, in sports and leisure, in career matters, and in health matters? And the answers range from 0 to 10, from completely unwilling to completely willing. And the measurement of trust attitudes is basically, it's kind of in the general social survey kind of framing. Are you in general willing to trust that? Or in general, people can be trusted, completely agree to completely disagree, and there's 4 potential answers. In general, you can rely on others, 4 potential answers, agree or disagree. Trust towards strangers, you can generally trust strangers, completely agree, completely disagree. Now, I'm putting these references because these papers have looked at the distribution of these answers and have done a lot of work on validating and looking at these measures. One of the things that they do in the Doman et al. And also in the FAIR paper is basically with a subsample of this panel, they run incentivized experiments. So where they actually pay them for the lottery choices. And what they find is that the correlations are pretty strongly significant and pretty high. And for the trust, they also use not a trust game, basically, which is an incentivized game in which there's a sender and a receiver, and there's a trust decision. I'm not going to go into details. And on top of that, if we look within this sample at correlations with field behaviors we would expect these measures to correlate with, we're actually finding what we would expect. So there's a strong correlation with investment in stocks, with being active in sports, with being self-employed, with smoking, and with occupational sorting. And there's not much work done on trust, but I checked, and for example, if you look at blood donations, they're correlated with trust. It's not a perfect measure of trust or trustworthy behavior, but it's kind of a pro-social behavior you would potentially expect to be correlated with. Okay.
Sorry, so what does it mean to be correlated here? What is the...
So you look at...
What outcome am I looking at? Like if I look at...
Whether the household invests in stocks.
No, but I mean more for the, like the lottery choice, for example.
What do you mean? Do you need more than a lottery choice?
They measure
No.
risk.
Yeah, what is the measure of risk in an incentivized lottery? I mean, it's not your paper, I know, but...
There's a variety of lotteries that you can choose from. So there's a list, and there's, for example, a certain outcome and a lottery. And you vary or you increase the sure amount while keeping the lottery fixed. And then there's, for example, 10 situations, so 10 sure amounts for a given lottery. And people look at the point at which you switch from the sure amount to the lottery.
So there actually, I can explain, there are 20 rows in a multiple price list. It increases the variance as you go down. They correlate, it's a Likert scale in the willingness to accept, of 0 to 7. They correlated with the switch point in the 1 to 20. The problem with that correlation is the linear switch point in the incentivized task maps non-linearly into risk attitudes. So in fact, the evidence of a correlation between two linear things when the true relationship is actually non-linear means nothing. That's kind of a standardly known thing. So the claims of validation are sort of a well-known problem with these. But I don't want to, you keep going.
Okay. So I don't have, so this is for a subsample, and with this subsample I couldn't look at this data. What I have looked at is there's also a hypothetical lottery choice in the style that's different than what Glenn is saying, but basically you choose how much you would invest for a given lottery, and I find qualitatively similar results. Now, these survey measures, they have technical problems, as Glenn was saying, and I'm saying that there might be measurement error. That's something that I cannot rule out. But what I think the relevant question is the measurement error can it be in such a way that it's biasing my results towards what I want? And what I'm in the end of the day going to do is going to look at the difference between two people. So if we assume that the measurement error is, let's say, equally distributed across men and women, and I take differences between couples that have been formed, maybe there's still some problem, but I think for my purposes, it may be fine. Okay, so this is actually from the data. So this is women and men, and those are the answers to the 6 questions. So you see from completely unwilling to completely willing to take risk, willingness to take risks in general, in financial matters, in career, car driving, sports and leisures, and health. Okay, so those are just the distributions, and what you see, there's a slight shift to the left for the women. So women are on average more risk averse, which is what we have seen in a large body of experimental evidence. For the men and the women, for trust attitudes, there's smaller differences. There's actually, and then you see it ranges from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So these are the data. Now, the first step before looking into the relationship between heterogeneity and marital dissolution or separation is to look at how similar are couples. The first thing is if couples are almost equal, then I'm not going to have any heterogeneity to exploit to look at separation in the future anyway. And if they are correlated, what patterns do I see in the data? So here are correlation coefficients between the men and the women. This is without controls, and this is adding a lot of controls. And what you see is the correlation coefficients. The first thing you see is they are strongly significant. So there is a clear evidence of positive assortative matching. The second thing you see is obviously they're smaller than 1. So there's variation in the data. And I'm going to show you how I construct a measure of heterogeneity. But there's definitely variation in the data. So not all couples are similar. So if you look at all these 6 dimensions, only 3.23% of the couples give exactly the same answer to the 6 questions. Those, I forgot to say, the surveys are taken separately. So that's important. So when the interviewer comes, they make sure that people are answering their survey separately and individually and not influenced by each other. What you see as well is that the correlations actually among the trust attitudes are stronger than for the risk attitudes. This may be part of survey design. Of course, there's less variation in the trust attitudes answers, so it's hard to interpret. Within the risk, the willingness to take risk, what you see is that actually the willingness to take risks in general is less correlated within the couple than financial matters, sports and leisure, career, and health. And so it seems that in more domain-specific behaviors, the correlations are stronger, which may be explained by the fact that you see those behaviors more clearly, or the fact that this is an aggregate of these different measures. So we have positive assortative matching, but there's still substantial heterogeneity. Now, what I want to do is to construct a measure of heterogeneity across these trust dimensions and across the risk dimensions. So what I do is I use principal component analysis. So basically, I use the standardized difference within a couple in each dimension, because there's 6 dimensions that they are strongly correlated. And then I basically let the data tell, using principal component analysis, how to weigh each dimension of risk and trust. So that's going to give me a principal component of the heterogeneity in risk and trust, which is basically the difference in risk and the difference in trust. And these are the distributions of this principal component, and it's standardized because I standardized the difference between each couple in each dimension. So to the left, you see risk attitudes, and to the right, there's trust attitudes. And what you see is there's a range of levels of heterogeneity across different couples. So if you think of the raw question, like how willing are you to take risks from 0 to 10, and you want to know an average difference, it's 2 in the data. Here I've standardized it, so it's difficult to see how large it is, but it's a difference of between saying 6 or 8. That's more or less the average difference. And for trust, I basically have a similar procedure.
Is anything of these anchored to a real outcome whose units we understand?
So not with these measures. So usually these are kind of Likert scales. So the usual approach also in psychology is just standardize and talk about it in standard deviations, because with this measure saying 1 higher in the Likert scale, it doesn't have much of an interpretation. So what I've tried to do is there's one question that is not in what I'm using now, which is a hypothetical lottery choice, which you could translate into a coefficient of relative risk aversion and then talk about the distance in relative risk aversion. The results are very similar. I prefer to use this measure because it captures the heterogeneity across different dimensions in a couple, and that is just one lottery choice that one person in the couple makes or another lottery choice. But maybe you're suggesting that it would be nicer to have a measure that has an easier economic interpretation.
In addition,
yeah.
But even with when you're saying, for instance, the difference is 2 in mean, what would be the standard deviation of the distribution among men? So is it that men are half a standard deviation away from the average of women? Is it half a standard deviation away from that of men, or is it 2 standard deviations away?
So it's more like, I don't have the data in my mind right now, but it's not 2. It's more like between 1/2 and 1.
Yes.
I have the absolute differences in a table in the appendix, but that's what I would expect. I mean, I could use just the absolute difference and not standardize it, but that also doesn't tell us much because the scale is from 0 to 10. So talking in terms of standard deviation gives us an idea of how strong these effects are.
But for a given, are the different dimensions correlated for each individual?
Yeah, within individual. So they are correlated within individual, and there's also correlation in the couple. So the idea of why I use principal component analysis is to try to get at that and have one measure. If I would put all of them together, they are highly correlated, the differences across the different dimensions.
So it's very strong within the individual? As
well, yeah.
Just to get an idea, within a person, what's the correlation between the various dimensions of risk?
0.4 to 0.5.
Yeah, because that could be also addressing Glenn's comment that in a sense the correlation is assuming a lot of linearity, and we know that that you expected. So.
Yeah. Sorry, what do you exactly?
No, but that's fine.
Okay. No.
So it's not huge.
No, it's not. It's not one. There is variation, and you see, for example, one thing that I forgot to say, which is if you look at the. Sorry.
There's another way of answering this is if you look at the first principal component,
Yes.
how much variance is explained?
50%. I use that one. I base my principal component analysis on the first principal component because the eigenvalue is something close to 2 as well, and the others are much smaller. But yeah, that's another way to look at it. Another way to look at it, I mean, maybe it's different than what you're referring to, is when you look at these measures and you correlate them to field behaviors, the domain-specific measure correlates much more with that field behavior than the general measure. So that's another way to think about it. Okay, so this is just one of the dependent variables that I'm going to use, the dependent variable that I'm going to use. So what I'm going to show you in this graph, basically before I show you the fit, is the percentile of the principal component of the standardized difference in risk attitudes in 2004 and the frequency of separation in the period of 2004 to 2013. If I drop 2004, because maybe it's the same year, then the results remain very similar. So this is the correlation.
Sorry, what you showed before were recently formed couples?
I look at all couples.
So you don't distinguish whether we have been married for 10 years or 2 years?
I can control for that, and I could look at subsamples.
Yeah,
so for example, yeah.
There's convergence in some of these results.
So these correlation coefficients, they are slightly smaller, but still strongly significant for couples that have been together less than 2 years. So the correlations are still there. So it's true that there's some, coming together, becoming more similar over time. But this correlation or positive assortative matching is present for newly weds or newly formed couples. But yeah. So basically, this is the correlation, and it's highly significant.
Could it also be that more risky people get separated more?
That's also true. But it doesn't. So I'm going to come to the regression, and I'm going to control for the risk level of the woman. In these regressions that I'm showing, I also have controls or robustness checks where I control for the man, the woman, but then I have to use a dummy variable for you are very different or not different in your risk attitudes. And if I do that, it also, both the man and the woman being more risk-seeking or less risk-averse, they are more likely to separate, but the difference still matters. So both things are definitely important, yeah. So if I look at it in terms of survival rates, what I find here, I'm only looking at 2 curves, and the one is the 25th percentile, and the other one is the 75th percentile.
Do we find information on the reason to divorce?
No. That would be great, yeah. No, I have some measures of happiness in marriage, but that's not going to help at all. No. So what I'm going, so this is risk, and for risk you see a strong correlation. For trust, there is positive assortative matching, and there's some kind of positive relationship, but it's not extremely strong. So risk seems to matter more, or seems to play a stronger role than trust. So what I'm going to do now is go into the regression and try to control for things as you were mentioning. So there's different ways I can do the regression. I've done hazard models. What I'm using now are panel random effects models, and I'm going to show you specifications with fixed effects and different things that I've tried. But this is the simplest model. I'm also going to show you linear probability models. I can also do the nonlinear probit models. The results remain very similar. I have the regressions also in the appendix. So what you see here is just the first column is just this measure of heterogeneity in risk attitudes, and the dependent variable is this likelihood of separation between 2004 and 2013, and just controlling for regional fixed effects. And you see that it's highly significant, and it's the effect of one standard deviation is increasing the risk of divorce or separation by 0.5%. It's not huge, but it's substantial, I would say, given that the divorce rate is like 1 to 2% per year, and in total I get this almost 10% over this period. if I look at trust only, then there's also this positive relationship. And if I look at both of them, the relationship risk matters substantially. I mean, it's more significant than trust, and trust becomes marginally significant. Then what I've done here in this regressions, which is coming to the level of the individuals and separating that from heterogeneity, with my measure of this principal component, they are very correlated if I have the man, the woman, and the difference. So here I'm only controlling for the woman. I know that has some limitations. But if I do a demi-variable for a bad match, I get very similar results. And so what you see is that you find the more willing the woman is to take risks, the more likely there is to be a divorce. And you don't find trust to play much of a role.
So this is a duration model.
It's not a duration model. It's a random effects panel linear probability model. Sorry.
So you look at every year these people are together?
Yes.
So it's a discrete time duration model?
Yes. 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 Okay. I could look at the hazard
so
kind of.
If somebody is in the marriage for 10 periods,
Yes.
then he's got P, 1 minus P.
Yes. So now in the the last two columns, what I do is I add controls that have been used in the literature before. So for example, in Weiss and Willis in the paper, I use difference in age at marriage, difference in religion, difference in education, and because it's Germany, I also use the difference in the location in which they were before 1989, so whether they resided both in West Germany, East Germany, or abroad. And I also include controls for the couple, like the household income, the log of the household income, then how many years they have been together, whether they're married or cohabiting, because in the sample I have both, whether they have been previously married, and whether they have kids from a previous marriage.
But you don't use anything about the riskiness of their income. I think that's what
No, that was a question
whether
that...
they're self-employed. Again, I could imagine.
So I'm going to look at the relationship between self-employment and heterogeneity later as a behavior that may be associated between heterogeneity and self-employment. But, I mean, I could...
Because, I mean, this gap in risk attitude might matter when people are exposed to risk. Otherwise, we don't do anything serious, like making decisions, it doesn't matter. But, when we are in turmoil, then these differences matter much more.
Yes, that could be a potential mechanism. That's why I'm going to look at whether the heterogeneity is related to self-employment, and the results there depend on the gender, actually. But I'm also going to look at income pooling. So one story is when you're exposed to risk and the insurance motive, so to say. The other story is the joint decision-making story, right, when there's indivisibilities. And so I'm going to try to look at the different dimensions in a bit to look at whether one story, let's say one argument, seems to weigh more in the data than the other.
So there's this one paper by Gang Lee. What they do is they look at the difference in credit scores at the time of marriage, and it predicts divorce.
Okay.
And so that kind of is through the channel, so it might reflect risk attitudes, but also exposure to risk. So if one does irresponsible things and has a lifestyle that, so that, lines up.
Yeah. Okay, nice. I'll check that paper. I didn't know about it. Yeah.
When it gets to a certain stage, we can't just keep adding stuff on the right-hand side that we know to be endogenous with respect to risk.
Yes.
I mean, at a certain stage, are we going to start writing a structural model down that says something depends on something else, or we're just going to keep adding stuff?
Yes, I mean, this is the first, as far as I know, the first body of evidence that tries to look at this heterogeneity in risk and related to this outcome, this marital outcome. And I'm taking it from, there's two motivations out there in the models in the literature for why it may be good, why it may be bad, quote unquote good and bad, and trying to look at patterns in the data for now. But you're right that the next step is to try to understand this in a more structural way and then have maybe a better, or let's say a more strict test of theories that we think should yield some prediction or another. But yeah. So one thing so there's two things that I've tried to... Sorry.
Why, just a clarifying question, why don't you just use the two level effects in an interaction effect between the spouse rather than heterogeneity? It's just a direct test of the substitution versus complement.
Okay, so the two levels and then the interaction?
Yeah, and the interaction of the levels.
I could do that. That's one thing that I actually haven't tried, but yeah.
I think that, well, you know, like a full quadratic with interactions. I think that would be, well, that's just as easy to interpret as what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah, I can definitely look at the data and see whether what comes is consistent with what I'm seeing here. Definitely. Yes.
One issue when you talk about reverse is how different are the outcomes from what you expected when you marry.
So expectations.
I don't know exactly how you will do it. I'm just saying I think it's the right way.
Yeah, so in this data set, I know you have looked at expectations about income in previous work. This is something that I don't have in this data set, like how much their earnings expectations. I know how much they earn in every year, and the panel has been running since 1984. So you can look at past years, but I don't have expectations in the data that I could look at.
And a key factor here, actually picking up on Yoram's point and in search of a structural model, is actually not so much expectations of levels, expectations of variability of income, if we're telling a story about risk attitudes, under EUT at least.
So I think one of the things that these questions or comments suggest is that looking at the variability of income and the exposure to risk are things that would be important to look at within this data. That I haven't really looked at variance in income, so that is the one thing that I can definitely look at. Unfortunately, I don't have expectations, so I cannot look at the role of surprises, which is definitely something that is important.
And also the correlation between the risks.
Yeah.
Just minor point, but here heterogeneity enters exactly the same whether it's positive or negative.
Yes.
You may want to distinguish.
Yes.
In other words, there's a couple in which the wife is more risk averse.
Yes.
And the husband may be normal, both, and
yes. Yeah, I've looked at that in very preliminary analysis. There didn't seem to be much in terms of the direction, but I can definitely look at it again in the more sophisticated analysis. So I mean, as I was saying, I'm not making any statements of causality here, but what I think there's two things that one can try to address is one is unobserved heterogeneity, because I have a panel, and the second thing is reverse causality, and I'm going to try to show you an instrument that is plausibly valid, and I'm happy to hear your comments. So on time invariant unobserved heterogeneity, what happened in this sample is that these measurements of risk and trust attitudes have been taken in 5-year intervals. So I have 2004, but I also have the same questions for this same panel in 2009. And for trust, it's 2003 and 2008. So basically what I can reduce this is to a two-wave panel, which I have 2003 and 2004, and use a fixed effects model to see whether I get still the similar results. This is random effects just because these are 2 years of the panel, and there's some attrition as well. But the fixed effects are the 3 columns here. And what you see is that there's if you look at tests of differences, there's for the 4th and 5th column compared to the 1st and 2nd, there's not much of a difference. For the 6th, once I include household income and changes in household income, things become a bit different. But even if I only would say the fixed effect is the only valid model, even in that model, the heterogeneity my measure of heterogeneity in risk preferences still predicts separation. So this is the first way of dealing one problem with the fact that I have a correlation, but at least ruling out or trying to rule out unobserved heterogeneity. The second issue is reverse causality, which could be if I'm in a bad marriage, I start behaving differently than my partner, and we start developing in different ways. So the fact, it's kind of the divorce is leading us to be different. Now, there's no perfect instrument in this data set, but one thing that has been shown in the literature is that regional risk attitudes are strongly related to individual ones. So people within the same sampling unit have actually highly correlated risk attitudes. So what I do is I look at the average woman and the average man in the region, excluding the individual. And I look at the difference between the average woman and the average man. And I use that as an instrument The idea being that that's related to the difference within the couple, but should be unrelated to divorce of that given couple.
Why is the first stage supposed to work?
These are, at the levels, they are strongly correlated. The level of risk attitude of the man and the woman within the region, and myself, well, let's say my neighbors and me, we're strongly correlated. And if I look at the differences, they are also correlated, I guess, because of these levels issue. I'm not sure, I don't have a perfect story for why the differences are actually correlated, but I see it in my data that they are. One thing that I think would not be valid is if I would look at the average difference in the region between the couples, because maybe I learned from others how different they are and I compare my other couples in the region to myself. But this is the difference between the average woman and the average man. And if I do this, so the regressions with IV, I still get a significant relationship. Now it's marginally significant, but actually the coefficient has become a little bit larger. So this is another way to try to deal with the issue that couples don't marry randomly, but still suggests that the relationship from heterogeneity to divorce is there. Okay, so mechanisms. Some issues could, so what I was talking about before briefly is about the risk. I mean, you have mentioned the exposure to risk and potential risk sharing or insurance kind of models or way of thinking about marriage. The other one that I think is another way to think about it is I make decisions with my couple, with my partner, and that's just joint decision making when there's indivisibilities may cause some frictions. And so what I'm going to look is at each of the dimensions, and I'm going to look at other behaviors. So when I look at each of the dimensions and I put them all together in the regression, they're highly correlated, but trying to see which one comes out to be important, actually you see that car driving, sports and leisure, and health are the ones that are significant when I put all of them together. Now, what's one potential interpretation of this is, well, in financial matters, you can actually split your money, and each of you does their own thing, so to say. That could be a way in which you can separate things. If you're driving in a car, there may be more of an indivisibility. We're both sharing this experience, and if they do share car driving, which this is a hypothesis, but I assume, and with health, you could imagine that smoking, if your partner smokes and you don't, maybe those are frictions that come into play. So this is just suggestive, but one could think of this being consistent with the story of indivisibilities or you having issues with your partner.
Sorry, quick question. This is also endogenous, I guess, but did you try to see how these interact with whether these couples have kids?
No, but so I can control for the number of kids, but you're saying, okay.
Well, I'm thinking about the interaction. You know, if your significant other drives like crazy and you have kids, you may not like that.
I haven't looked at it. Yeah, no, it's true.
Experience.
So I've looked at two behaviors which could or could not be related to inter-household heterogeneity and risk attitude. So if I'm thinking about insurance, if we're different, then maybe want to income pool and insure each other. But if we're making joint decisions with the money and we just can't agree on that, maybe we just don't want to pool our incomes. And there's one question in the survey which asks, do you pool your income or do you each of you handles it separately? And there's like 20 to 25% of the people separate their income, so each person deals with their own money, while 75 to 80% pool, and there's different arrangements, like he manages the money, I manage the money, we both take from the money. I'm considering all of those the same for now. And entrepreneurship, I was thinking potentially along different lines that you were suggesting before, but if you think about it, if we're very different and if I'm very risk-seeking and I want to start a business, then it's actually very good to have a partner that is risk-averse. So that would be the insurance that I'd like. That's great. Maybe we should see it in the data. So what we see is the first two columns are for income pooling. So couples that are more heterogeneous in their risk attitudes are less likely to pool their income, which is consistent with the idea of potentially joint decision making and having fights, you could say. The insurance idea comes in with the men being self-employed. But this is actually, if you look at the data, I think it's a selection effect. So men who are self-employed are also more likely to be in the relationships that are where their partner is very different from them. That's what I see in the data. While for women, you see the opposite effect, and women don't tend to be in different relationships.
It could be, I mean, I understand that selection is a natural explanation, but it could be background risk. It could be that, you know, if I realize that my income of the household coming mostly from the husband is extremely volatile, then I become very averse to additional risk.
Yes. No, that could be, yeah. So these are just, so trying to understand the story that I see in general, I think it's important to look at behaviors that you would expect to be consistent with either one story or the other. And, well, the picture is mixed, right? Because you split your income if you're different, but you're actually seeing this potential idea of the background risk and sharing. Okay, so that's it. So risk and trust matter for the formation and the dissolution of households. Risk attitudes are important predictors for separation. So the heterogeneity in risk attitudes matters, but also the level of risk-seekingness of each of the individuals. And one reason why this heterogeneity may matter is it may make joint decision-making more difficult. I mean, we've seen that what we see is some of the heterogeneity in risk attitudes with respect to joint activities, like car driving, is what matters more. And if we look at income pooling, you see less, let's say, collaboration within the couple when there's more heterogeneity. Okay, thank you.